I'm Todd Jones, recovering from 30 years as a sports writer. Thanks for joining me as I sit down with some of the best sports writers of our time, who knew the greatest athletes and coaches and experienced firsthand some of the biggest sports moments of the past half century. We'll share stories behind the stories, some we've only told each other. Pull up a seat on Press Box Access. If sports writing had a mayor, it would be Vahe Gregorian. He is as beloved by his peers as anyone in the business. No matter where or when you encounter Vahe, he's always there to support his fellow journalist. Always. He's an empathetic soul, a deep thinker, and he can report and write with the best of them. Vahe's columns make you think and make you feel. You'll understand when you hear his stories on this episode. Vahe, thanks for joining us in our tavern known as Press Box Access.
Todd, I am thrilled to be with you. It's so great just to have a chance to catch up with you after so long. We don't see each other enough anymore, but you're a forever friend, and what a delight to get to do this with you.
Well, my motto is any time with Vahe is time well spent, you know. I think one time in New York City, you and I were at the Olympic Media Summit, and we were at Ground Zero, and we started talking and walking, and we kept walking and talking and talking and walking and walking and talking, and next thing you know, we were at Times Square. We went from Lower Manhattan to Midtown.
That's a good... You know, it occurs to me as you say that, I've been looking forward to this for a while, but I thought about not only the adventures each of us has had the opportunity to have in this, but the adventures we've had together, of course. And I mean, I think the first picture we ever had taken together is maybe the first picture I ever posted on Facebook. It was one of you and Laurie Shantz and me on the beach in, I'm suddenly forgetting which beach in Sydney.
I think it was Manly Beach.
It was Manly Beach.
Yes.
And it was when the torch was about to come by. And what I remember about that moment was our joy in being there, but I think we all felt kind of emotional seeing the joy of the Australian people. You had this sense that they felt the world coming to them in a way that generation hadn't known. I remember seeing tears.
Yeah, people.
And I think we posed for pictures with some of the Australians. And anyway, it's just it's a powerful little microcosm of some of the things we've gotten to do together, from Ground Zero to Australia to you name it.
Yeah, we've been around and never been convicted either. So there you go.
As far as you know.
Hey, on all seriousness, congratulations are in order. The U.S. Basketball Writers Association has selected you a member of its 2022 Hall of Fame class. An honor well-deserved, and I'm so happy for you, Vahe. What does that mean to you?
I'll tell you what. I mean, the funny way to look at it is it means you've been around a while. It made me think of the one of the terms, though, that Norm Stewart used when he went into the College Basketball Hall of Fame about how if you see a turtle up on a fence post, you figure it didn't get there by itself. And I do think of that. But I'll tell you know what it took me to. This is really true. In some capacities with the Basketball Writers Association, I had the opportunity to let a couple people know they were going in and to interview them about their experience. And those couple of those people were ones that are either very familiar to you or near and dear to you. Tom Archdeacon, right. Which led me to get to interview Tom, to write about him, which, I mean, think what a gift that was. And I think I was the last person to interview Frank DeFord before he died, because Frank was in a funny kind of category. For a long time, the Basketball Writers Association wasn't necessarily recognizing people who weren't in the association, and that was sort of determined to be an oversight. And so all of which is to say, it's very nice to stop and pause and kind of have at least your professional life flash before your eyes, which, as you know, is more than just your professional life. We probably all get a little too entwined with our identities in this work. Mm-hmm. Or if I'm saying that not exactly the way I meant it, but I think you understand what I mean.
Right.
And so in some ways it's inseparable, and really nice just to hear from so many peers.
Yeah.
And that is a lot of the joy of this work, as our relationship attests to, but also the fact that you have this podcast with an infinite amount of people that you're getting to talk to that are all interesting. And I think that in itself reveals something special about the business.
Well, Vahe, the fact that you plugged our podcast while you're on our podcast says everything there is about you. You're always thinking of others. I raised this idea that you're getting honored, and you immediately start talking about other people who are honored. And hey, in all seriousness, the fact that you're going to be in New Orleans for the Final Four receiving that honor, I couldn't be happier. I unfortunately will not be there. If you see my liver anywhere in the streets of the French Quarter, it's from years past. I will not be there. I will be there in spirit. And really, spirit is the word I always think about when I think of you, Vahe, because, as a Kansas City Star columnist, somebody rightfully said that you're a writer who makes you think and makes you feel. And I think that's not easy to do in this day and age, somebody who has an empathetic spirit and is able to cut through all the clutter and the noise and get to the human nature of the story. And you are certainly one who does that so well. So I'm very happy for you.
Well, let me add one real quick thing there, Todd, just because it really moved me to the depths of my soul, I have to admit, when our friend Shannon Ryan from the now president of the Basketball Writers Association called to tell me. She used some terminology like that, and Shannon is somebody I really admire and have so enjoyed getting to know. And I just immediately, I don't know if I burst into tears, but I was a little shaken up, and that was such a lovely thing to say, and that's all. There's nothing more, I guess, needs to be said about it. But I was for once at a loss for words.
Well, it taps into the emotion, right? It's the emotion of what we write about, what we cover, the athletes, the coaches. We sometimes forget they're humans, and you've always been one who's been able to capture that emotion. You mentioned that day at the Sydney Olympics at Manly Beach, and I often think of that too. I mean, I could still see that flame off in the distance coming towards us, and as it did, these thousands of people, just the noise, the crescendo of noise, it was like a wave overcoming us. And I think about that. And I also think about those games, about a story that you wrote for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, who you then worked for 25 years, by the way. There was a wrestler named Sammy Henson, and he was from St. Louis, and he was in the gold medal match. He was in the gold medal match at 119 pounds, and he suffered a 4-3 defeat, which, for an Olympian is just devastating. He lets out this primal scream, and he takes off. Can you tell us about that story that you covered that day in Sydney?
Yeah, I'm so glad you're asking about that, just because I think about that story in a lot of different ways. In some ways, I think it's... this sounds a little lofty, but part of we feel like this calling is to try to understand and take people where they don't get to go, but also I think be empathetic and confront all these things at once as the challenge in the job. I think that it happens often, and this one sort of sizzled that all together for me. So one little quick piece of background on this before I go to that moment. Todd, the precious thing about covering the Olympics isn't necessarily getting to see Michael Phelps win 8 gold medals. For a lot of us, and I know this was true for you, and certainly for me, the thing that's most moving about the Olympics often is what you take in on the ground there, but also the chance to cover your local athletes.
Right.
The people that you've gotten to know that are looking to talk to you, want to talk to you because you've cared about them, paid attention to them, written about them, know their families over the years. And Sammy's a great example of that, and the sort of thing that I fear gets lost as the changing of the guard and how the business is unfurling. I think that kind of thing is less valued today, but I digress. Sammy grew up in the St. Charles area of St. Louis, and I'd gotten to know him a little bit over the years, but as it led up to the Olympics and we knew he was going to have a great chance to medal, I went and spent a day and a half or so with him in Oklahoma. And that was a great commitment by the Post-Dispatch. It's, go send somebody down there for a couple of days. But that led to a feeling of trust between Sammy and me that you wouldn't have otherwise, right? If you're just somebody that shows up there. So, long story short, you described it well. The match ends, and Sammy is in a frenzy. I mean, he is overcome with. He's in despair. I think that's the word I used in my lead. That he was in panic and despair, and he runs off the mat into the stands, screaming, tearing the top of his singlet down. Now, it sounds like a spectacle, but it was truly horrifying. I mean, what you saw before you was what felt like somebody broken and shattered is a better word, I guess. And now, what do you do as a journalist? I mean, you don't want to be an ambulance chaser. On the other hand, I'm there to document what happens with Sammy. I mean, he's my local. That's the main reason I'm there.
He's your local, right? Yeah. So
a few of us, I think it was Jack McCallum from Sports Illustrated, and I don't remember who else, sort of tried to gently follow Sammy's path and find him in the fetal position in a hallway weeping. And one of his coaches had to pick him up and carry him back out of view. And, I think everyone standing there were many of us, maybe 4 or 5 of us, was, feeling this strange straddling of, shame and what do I do? Like, I'm watching this. What do I do with this? So hours pass, and others just at that point have to move on to other stories. But again, he's my local, and I obviously understand there's something very deep and profound in this. But I also know that he's not ready to talk. So I waited like 3 hours for him to come out, and he came out and he said he couldn't talk. And at that point, I'm like, I don't know what to do, but I respect it and I understand it. And he told me, hey, call me in my hotel room in a little while. So now it's, the pace of these things, but luckily we've got a little buffer on the time zone from Sydney. We've already missed the Saturday paper, I think is how it was. So,
right.
So now I'm into the next cycle. And try to simmer down this long story. But so I get Sammy on the phone, and this is 5 hours after the match. He's still in his singlet, and he's just opening up about everything. How he threw the silver medal down. He didn't want it, and we just talked about everything. He was very emotional, and so I ended up writing it, and I wrote it rather personally. And I bring that up because that was not everybody's cup of tea. I heard from people who were furious that thought I had betrayed him by being, so direct about what he had gone through.
Right.
And that doesn't just roll off your shoulders. I mean, you're trying to think this through. On the other hand, I felt like I was true to the story he was telling me. And anyway, just to finally bring us in for a landing, I heard from him a few hours later, which is hard to believe. Even in 2000, that the Jurassic days of the internet, we were seeing this stuff. And he told me, he thanked me so much because he said he felt like somebody understood.
Wow.
And I mean, that sends chills through me. And the complication of this, I mean, you have to be thinking about writing for your audience and you have to be considerate of the people you're writing about. On the other hand, you're writing the story. You can't be just thinking about them in the story. There's so many things going on in our heads. And I don't mean to make it sound like rocket science, but there are a lot of different things, plates to spin and things to consider as you do these things. But I suppose I felt like it was okay for me to hear him say that, that and it was more than okay. It was probably just a huge reassurance that I hadn't violated him when writing about something so meaningful?
It's a fine line. It's a fine line you have to walk down, and the fact that he was willing to talk to you shows the trust that you built up with him beforehand, and he trusted that you would handle it in a way that was true to the story, and then he thanks you for it. And I got to tell you, I went back this morning and reread that story. I have it in a Best American Sports Writing collection, and I reread it just to reconnect with that type of emotion. And, that story was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, and it's, that says a lot right there, right? But what I really think it says is that you captured the moment when a human was in despair and handled it very graciously.
Well, thank you. And really, of all the things you could, it's funny because you say there's a fine line and all these things, but I suppose that might be the best feeling of all, to feel like you cared about another person in such a way that you could represent their story properly, even for all its sort of warts and thorns. I mean, I think, right. Look, I don't know, Todd, what the whole mission is exactly in this line of work. I mean, we're in journalism, but we're in a little subset. And now once you become a columnist, that's a little different too. But I do think if you can feel like you're somehow speaking to whatever you want to call it, the human condition, the human spirit, that's a pretty good motivator for the work for me. I mean, I think if you're able to make people feel, and that's a big challenge. I don't know if a lot of times you try to make people feel and maybe you don't. Mm-hmm. But if you're able to do that, I feel like that's quite a lot more important than just pontificating or telling it like it is, so to speak. I'm doing air quotes around that.
Exactly. Right.
But I think that's the mission in some cases. And I don't want to say that people are wrong that view it that way. I just think we do all need to gravitate to what moves us and our own personalities, or what are you doing this for?
Right. Well, it certainly moved a lot of people. You put people in that moment and captured that moment for a person. And you've also done that in basketball arenas around the country. I mean, you've covered, 21 Final Fours? I mean, I think 22, 21. And in your 25 years at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch before you went to Kansas City, you covered a lot of college sports, a lot of college basketball. When I think about what you had to write about, it was Kansas, Missouri, right? That was the rivalry.
Yeah. That's a great rivalry. And it is funny, we always feel the need to compare these things. And I think they're not really comparable a lot of times. I mean, I think we understand that Louisville, Kentucky is its own thing. Duke, Carolina is its own thing. Each thing is sort of about its own audience.
Exactly.
And its own context. And Missouri, Kansas has sort of roots and history and entanglements that are different. And I should just say different. I wouldn't presume to say that rivalry is better per se. I just don't. Those things really are apples and oranges, but it's special.
Well, think about this. It predates college sports itself.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And here, we live in a city that people pay attention to the fact which side of state line road you're on, and there's some sort of legendary stuff that may or may not be true. One example is that how Norm Stewart always fed into the rivalry with such statements as, that he'll never spend money in Kansas, et cetera. Well, toward the end of Norm Stewart's career, actually, well after Norm Stewart's career, was when Missouri went to the SEC and the rivalry was sort of gone for the moment. I did a piece on the end of the rivalry, and I got Norm on the phone, and for some reason, I can't remember how it came up. I think I said, so you really never spent money in Kansas? And he goes, oh, no, I just made that up. It played well, and I just kept saying it. And in fact, Norm's wife grew up in Kansas, and his son lives in the house she grew up in. Yeah, so a lot of theater involved in that, but that's kind of what makes it fun too.
Well, Norm was the longtime Missouri coach, I think from 1967 to 1999. You had over on the Kansas side, you were dealing with Roy Williams for many years and Bill Self since 2003. You've witnessed a lot of those games. Is there one that stands out or a moment that stands out to you when you think about Kansas, Missouri?
Well, a lot of amazing moments. Maybe the bookend of it is what comes to mind for me. The first Missouri-Kansas game I ever went to was, I think it was 1989 in Allen Fieldhouse, and it was number 1 versus number 2.
Wow.
It might have been 90. I think it was 89. And I could not believe the wonderland I was walking into. I mean, it was unbelievable and intoxicating, really. And
well, what was it like for somebody who's never been in Allen Fieldhouse? What was that like?
Yeah, that's a great way to ask, too. I mean, it's important to say that. It was sort of sense around the sense of everything around you was crackling. And the constant roar of the crowd. I mean, you've been in these different environments where there's something always sort of percolating, bubbling, a noise it's not background, but it's just always there. And then, of course, with its peaks, and then with things like, at that point, it was quite a novelty to have ESPN with its game day or whatever the right term was for it on site. First time I'd ever seen it, and here's. As a young writer stepping into this, I'm walking down on the court, and there's Dick Vitale next to me talking to somebody, and it just was a smorgasbord of the senses. I'm reaching for words, but and the arena itself makes that. Right? I mean, there's something that only a few arenas can really conjure in you, just because of the history. You can practically feel sweating out of the building and.
Yeah, I mean, it was what? I think it was built in opened in 1955.
Yeah, right in the mid.
Holds about 16,000.
Yeah, so. Right in the mid 50s, and bleachers and people are, in a sense, people are all just pressed up against each other, right? And that's and they're sardined in. So it's like
a punk rock concert, right? With basketball in the middle of it.
Yeah, might as well have been. And one thing. So this is just a quick aside, but. My parents, they didn't exactly relate to the work, but they took a sweet and special interest in it. And at one point, I kept trying to explain to them how consuming a lot of these things were. And they decided they want to come out for a Missouri-Kansas game.
Oh, wow.
And so it was in Columbia. And I still remember after the game seeing how red my mom's face was from the excitement and the noise and all that. She was overwhelmed. I don't know if she loved it, but she was overwhelmed. And then when I say the bookend, the other thing is that the last 2 games of the rivalry as we knew it in that final season before Missouri left for the SEC were 2 of the best basketball games you'll ever see on back and forth on each court. And we did a big project at the Star on it recently with sort of an oral history of all that. And Todd, this, it just pick it up and put it into any different rivalry, the characters involved, and that also comes from a day where, we knew people a little better than we might now, right? Especially in COVID.
Right.
But I mean, that's a day when, the writers were, we knew all the coaches at the other schools in ways we don't know now. I mean, I still remember.
You knew the backstories, right?
Yeah, I knew their backstories, but it was important for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch to go sit down with Roy Williams at Kansas and visit with him about who he was, or write about things from the KU perspective, even from the other, for the St. Louis audience. And so Roy, I remember, being fortunate to get to know Roy and how quaint this is. I remember him calling me back from payphones at his son's high school games. Wow. And I say that it's really nothing about like, oh, I knew Roy so well. I don't mean that. I did know Roy in a way I really enjoyed, but that was what Roy did with
exactly,
media he got to know, and these days there aren't too many people that are as I don't know, accessible as that. I mean, Bill Self really is. He's a bit of a throwback too. But there's a lot of colorful people around all this, and it certainly keeps you energized.
Hi, podcast listeners. I'm Carol Costello, a former CNN anchor and national correspondent. This January, I'm launching a podcast about one of the first cases I ever covered as a journalist. It's one that stuck with me all of these years, the one that buried itself under my skin and stayed put. It's a true crime series about an amazing woman named Phyllis Cottle, who defied torture and death and brought a fierce rage to the quest to find her attacker. Carol Costello presents Blind Rage. It's a production of Evergreen Podcasts and signature title of the Killer Podcast Network. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Discover more great true crime and paranormal programming at killerpodcast.com.
Well, I think about, being in Allen Fieldhouse in that cauldron of noise and heat and emotion, and you think about those years. You did 25 years at St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and then you moved to Kansas City in 2013 to become the columnist, where you're still writing as a columnist. I mean, St. Louis is a pro town, but you're in a different city, Kansas City, where you're starting to get to know some of the icons of that city, people like Tom Watson, George Brett. How's that transition for a writer to go from these big, giant moments and games and scenes to getting to know an individual like a Kansas City icon like Tom Watson?
The thing that's all of us encounter this all the time in the work is, how to build a new relationship, or how do you get to know somebody? And, a little daunting to try to get to know a George Brett or Tom Watson, I suppose, from the outside looking in. But on the other hand, after all this time, I think you come to realize that once you can get face to face with somebody, they're not that giant the same way that you might see them from the outside. I'm not diminishing the status of any of these people. I don't mean that. I just mean you realize they are people.
Exactly.
I don't know if this is true for you, but I'll say this: the times I've struggled most with, like, whoa, I'm not sure if I can talk to him or her, isn't when it's somebody that's of such stature now. It's somebody that was perhaps a childhood hero. Right.
Well, it's funny
tough.
You mentioned Watson, and I grew up watching golf as a child, and he was the guy. He was battling Nicklaus, and so I remember being a young writer, and I was working in Cincinnati, and I got sent up to Columbus for the Memorial Tournament, which is Nicklaus's tournament, PGA Tour, and I arranged to have breakfast with Watson. So, I'm a little nervous the night before. I'm trying to do all my prep work. I'm trying to get all my security blankets in line, to show that I'm prepared. And I meet him the next morning, and he stopped early on, and one of the questions I asked and said, well, you really did your homework, or you're very prepared. And that kind of eased my tension. And then what really eased my tension was he was answering a question while he was eating, and a grape flew out of his mouth and landed on my plate. And we both looked at each other, and he just went, sorry. So at that moment, he wasn't Tom Watson, this Hall of Fame golfer. Yeah. He was just another guy whose grape flew out of his mouth and landed on my plate. And you're right. They are people. They are human.
That'll go a long way towards demystifying somebody. My experience with Tom was a little bit like yours. I went up. I actually first met him up in Nebraska at a event up there, and I called his office a day or two before just to see if it's possible to arrange time with him. And no sooner did he come off the podium, we didn't get breakfast. I didn't have a chance to get a grape shot at me, but we just sat down over on the side, and I thought he'd give me 2 or 3 minutes, and it wasn't an hour, but it was a good 20 minutes, and one of those 20 minutes where it's like, okay, you got everything you need. I mean, he was very cordial that way and helpful, and it was a really fun story to write, and certainly I've had a chance to spend maybe a half dozen times with Tom in his office now, covered his last Masters, and really a neat thing to get to do. I mean, certainly on whatever we consider the Mount Rushmore of Kansas City sports figures, Tom and George Brett are certainly two of them. Maybe you have to do one from 50 years ago or another more modern one. I don't know. We don't need to debate that now, but it's been nice to spend some time with both of them. And
yeah, and
George is sure a lot of fun.
They've both suffered the human loss of a friend from ALS, so they have this bond that you wouldn't think that, again, they're these icons in sports, but you don't think that they have their own personal issues or ups and downs. And here they are with Watson losing his caddy, Bruce Edwards, and I know George Brett lost a friend to ALS, and those two guys have worked together to try to help with an ALS cure, right?
They have, and it's really alert of you to know that, and surely reflects either knowledge or preparation. I'm so glad you know that, because they join together at a event every year, and we're pretty faithful about going to that event. The legendary star sports columnist and later editor Joe McGuff died from ALS, and his name's been attached to this for a long time. And so Tom and George always have something interesting and compelling to say, and our friends at the ALS Society or Association are always providing important information to get out there every year. This is a twist on this, but I wrote about this a few years ago. It turns out that Lou Gehrig played his last baseball game in Kansas City.
Is that right?
Because he had been suffering from some conditions he couldn't, they weren't able to determine. And the Yankees had a farm team here, the Kansas City Blues. And in 1939, they played an exhibition game here. And Gehrig kept feeling increasingly weak, just batted once. He got on a train from Union Station here up to the Minnesota and the Mayo Clinic. And next thing you know, there's the diagnosis.
Wow, I never knew. I never knew he had that tie with Kansas City in that regard. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Just a little twist.
Well, again, you think of these iconic names in sports, and you see them, do what they do so well on the field or on a court, and you don't think of them behind the scenes. And I think as a writer, trying to get them to know them behind the scenes helps contextualize the way you present them to an audience. At the same time, it also is difficult because it could be somebody, like you said, that you grow up with. And I wanted to ask you about a person in that regard, and that's the late Gale Sayers. I know Gale passed away in 2020 at the age of 77, the Chicago Bears Hall of Fame running back. And you wrote a column a few years prior to that in March of 2017, which kind of, broke the news about the fact that he was dealing with dementia. And I wanted to hear from you about the day that you went to Gale's house and spent 7 hours with him and his wife, Artie. Yeah,
well, I really like how you connected that point, Todd, because I'm a little older than you, but I'm sure for you, a lot of your first impressions of Gale Sayers were, like a lot of us, from Brian's song.
Exactly, right.
And, because his career was kind of cut short, those of us of a certain age, I think, have that aspect of him seared into us more than what an incredible player he was, just because that's how we came to know him. So Gale, I had written something the fall before that mentioned that a Chiefs player, Tyreek Hill, had accomplished a couple records that hadn't been reached since Gale Sayers, or maybe even surpassed them. And that led to a friend of mine, a longtime former KU sports information director, Jeff Bolig, saying, hey, Gale, you might want to check into Gale Sayers and see how he's doing. I think Jeff had some understanding of the situation. And long story short, Gale was to be honored at a banquet in Topeka as a Kansas Man of the Year or something, which is a little overdue.
A little bit. I mean, they missed the mark on that one.
nonetheless, I went, and in the first moments of meeting Gale, you certainly wouldn't have thought there was anything amiss, but you could tell that he wearied fast, and I ended up sitting at a table with him, and as time went on during the banquet, I certainly had the sense he was a little disoriented and required a lot of attention. But what was really jarring was that KU put on a great film of highlights of his career, and it included some Brian song moments.
Yeah, by the way, that's the movie about his friendship with Brian Piccolo, who died of cancer while they were teammates. And again, of a certain generation, it's a movie that, we immediately have emotion about. So
yeah, I'm glad you clarified that. And so this movie that is a lot of how we all remember him or look at him is playing, and it becomes clear to me that Gale does not know what he's watching.
Oh, wow.
And I just wanted to weep. It was just so strange. And so somehow or another, I came to think that there'd been a lot of people had a little sense of this, but that people didn't really know what was up with Gale. And I came to think that it might be important for the family, for people to know what's happening with Gale, instead of sort of just, he's not himself, or things like that. And so I met his wife that night, and we kept up a little bit of a dialogue, but I think she was not altogether sure she wanted to put the spotlight on this.
Right.
And then just this oddity that I had to go to Dayton for an NCAA tournament game, and I just thought I should check in with her that I'm kind of in the neighborhood, and I mean, neighborhood 3 hours away, but if it were,
they lived in Indiana, right?
Yeah, up near Chicago, and she said, "Sure, why don't you come up?" And so it was a very emotional day. I spent all day with them, and I was privileged. I really was privileged to get to write about it, and I'd say certainly one of the most emotional days of my professional life, and I'll never forget it. I took some pictures that day, and we ran a couple with them. I wanted to make sure I asked permission from Artie, his wife, about the appropriateness of them, because they did, I think, kind of illustrate something more than maybe the words could say about his state.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you asked about it. I'm glad I did it. I felt like it was actually helpful to the family for people to understand what was happening with Gale, but it was still unsettling. Unsettling to work on.
Why do you think his wife already invited you up? Do you think she wanted the story told?
I think she did, but I think it became one of those things where she didn't really know whether she wanted to until I was actually in the house.
Yeah.
As I recall, it might well have been that I was there and she might have said, and believe me, I'm not saying there was some great charm in play. I think the point is that as she got talking about it in this context, trying to explain what's become of Gale and who he is, I think she felt more and more momentum about that it could be constructive and help others.
Right.
I think that was a really important point for her, because I think a lot of people in these situations are in doubt about what to do. I think also they're stigmatized, and I think that was a lot of her motivation.
Right. And, the fact that Gale Sayers' wife trusted you to invite you up is kind of like the story about Sammy Henson. You have to build that trust, and then when that person is willing to tell their story, you have to be able to handle it in a way that serves the greater good. And, I think Sayers, the column about Sayers did that, because it helps shine a light on a topic that does need more discussion and debate and thought. And, that's a game. Football's a game that takes a physical toll and it can lead to some bad things. But, sometimes things happen in life that you're a journalist and you just get thrown into suddenly. And there's another moment I think of that, and that's in January of 2017 when Yordano Ventura, the great Kansas City Royals young pitcher, died at age 25 in a car accident in his native Dominican Republic. And you got on a plane and went down there. And I think you've told me that you think about that a lot.
I do think about that a lot, and it represents a lot of things at once. The Royals are to me, a little bit of a model organization in terms of how they feel not just connected to the community, but actually engage. And this was, to me, a very prime example. Yordano Ventura died early on a Sunday morning, and by that afternoon, my dear colleague, Sam Mellinger, was in Atlanta, and the Royals general manager happened to be in Atlanta, Dayton Moore. And by that afternoon, Sam was over in Dayton's hotel room. Now, I don't know what it's like in a lot of other towns. I just don't. But I suppose I could count on one hand the amount of franchises that would go through such a thing and have sports columnists from the town in their hotel room that afternoon. And at that point, Sam I asked Sam to ask Dayton if it's okay to embed with the team in the Dominican. And Dayton said, absolutely. So I got on a plane the next day and went to Santo Domingo. I'd been there before to do a story on Yordano. And the next morning at 6 a.m., we got on a bus to ride 3 hours to Las Terrenas. And it might have been one of the most important days of work of my life because it was such a remote location and there was a fan base really suffering. I mean, this guy was very popular and, seemed to have a brilliant future in front of him, represented the rise of the Royals to, from going nowhere to back-to-back World Series. And now suddenly he's gone. And I started tweeting from the bus that morning and try to be also, this complication, try to be gentle about when to see if you could talk to guys on the bus. I mean, the bus was not full. People were spread out.
Right.
And wanted to, it's a little strange for them to have me and our wonderful photographer, John Sleezer, on the bus. On the other hand, these guys knew us. And we could pick some spots where to sort of feel out if somebody wanted to talk, and they did. But the reason I bring up Twitter is pretty soon we realized that a lot of Kansas City was following along. I mean, any photo or video was being tweeted or retweeted hundreds, if not thousands of times. And there's a lot of reasons we do this job, whether it's the adventure or the emotion or all these things. But if you ask what the duty is, it's to serve your community one way or another. And I felt like John and I were in a position to do that in a way we would probably never know before or after again, because there were some other media outlets down there, but they weren't embedded. I'm sure they did a great job, but we were sort of in a fortunate position. And it felt like it felt important to our community. And that's what I asked Dayton at the end. I said, Dayton, why'd you let us come along? I mean, this is a pretty intimate and an excruciating day for the organization. And he said, Kansas City needs to be here with us. Basically, the words he said.
Wow.
Excuse me. And I just don't know many people that think that way. And so,
Vahe, I have seen video of that day, and I read your beautiful, heart-wrenching column. But it was like 90 degrees, and there's hundreds of people on rooftops. And does that stick out in your mind? What was it like to actually be in that procession?
A couple different things, Todd, were really very powerful. One of the things was we went to the funeral, or really it really was a funeral, but I'm in a room in my house now. It was in a room no bigger than this, and with probably 70 people in there, with David Ortiz greeting people at the door to console them. And we're all crammed in this room, and the Royals, he left the Royals by then, a former player, Gerard Dyson. I'll never forget him just kind of crumpling into Dayton Moore's arms, just weeping. And then to see, I know I'm talking a lot about Dayton, but he's an extraordinary man. And there was a moment where he just stepped up and took the hands of Yordano's family and told them what an honor it is to mourn with them. And I just remember thinking, I'm probably not quoting the words exactly right, but it was out of body emotional to see that, the way he was saying it and the way he was feeling it. So we left from there and went over to the baseball field where Yordano had played, and that was more public. And then the walk you're referring to was a good mile and a half, with thousands of people walking in the street, and all these people with the Royals walking with them, not getting on the bus. I mean, David Glass, the owner, Dayton, just all of them,
Ned Yost, the manager, the players.
Yeah, Ned. I mean, all these people so hot. But what struck me was they're just walking among the Dominican people as one. I remember seeing a sign on the side of the road. A woman was holding up a sign that said, "Thank you, Kansas City, for your love and support." And then, of course, to the burial. Anyway, it was really surreal in a lot of ways, but to see that connection with Royals front office, Royals players, just being as one, really, with the Dominican people, that was unforgettable, and it I think made a great impact on people who were suffering.
Yeah, like you said, the people of Kansas City, they wanted to be there with you. And you were kind of a representative. That's what a journalist does. A journalist is a conduit and takes the reader or the viewer, or takes those people to places that they don't get the privilege to go to. And I say privilege in an honorable way because, at a funeral, you're honoring that person and the people that are hurting. And you're there. You're there on the scene. And it takes a lot. It takes a lot as a writer to try to articulate what it's like to be there. And, you did it in such a fashion, that column, the Sayers column, several others that year. I mean, APSC named you the top columnist in the nation for large newspapers because of those type of columns. And that's what I've always thought about, the emotion that you're able to get across to people who aren't there. And sometimes that emotion is great and fun emotion too. I mean, think about it. Kansas City, since you arrived, it's been like Title Town. I mean, they're nothing for years. You show up, and all of a sudden they're in 2 World Series, they're in 2 Super Bowls. They got these great, they got these great players. It's all Vahe, right? What has it been like to chronicle the great emotion of Kansas City sports in the last decade?
It's been incredibly fortunate, and just what a twist on the narrative of 3 decades, right?
Right.
But I'm glad you phrased that and framed that the way you did, because it's right. Remember the whole theme of the wide world of sports, the agony of defeat, but also the joy of these things. And again, this is really true. When the Royals went to the World Series in 2014, and when they won the wild card game, which was one of the most bizarre and remarkable sights you'll ever see, the way they came back, and you felt like, let me say it this way: that's 2014. I've been here about a year at that point, and getting to write about those things was like having you're getting slingshotted into fast forward in the sense of being here, like living here, being connected to something vital to people. It was, our audience won't see this because we're talking to each other in a call where we can see each other. Behind me is a plate of the, I think the 30 days of the coverage, the covers every day, and that was it. What I mean, we do this for a lot of reasons, but that's certainly one of them, right? To get chronicle a championship run, and suddenly you're going coast to coast to coast, doing it, and it's you're out of your mind, tired, but that's compensated for with adrenaline and caffeine. So it's
a couple beers.
But look, aren't those the times where think again to Olympics, for instance. I mean, no sleep. You're a little tired, a little frustrated, maybe a little cranky here and there, but ultimately you're just infused with this adrenaline of, I can't believe I'm here and I get to do this.
Exactly.
And I get to talk to these people and try to bring it back home.
Well, yeah. I mean, think about it. Like, even when you're not at the Olympics, just when you're in your town, if it's Kansas City or whatever city you're working in, if that town is enjoying success the way the Chiefs and the Royals have in the last decade, it just lifts everybody up. There is something, it's artificial, right, the sense of community, but it's real, too. It's a bizarre thing. It's games, it's sports, and yet it does mean something more than that when a city can just celebrate, and Lord knows we all need to feel better. And so when you're writing about that, it's like you're getting to spread some joy.
Yeah.
You're like Santa Claus.
Yeah, you're right. And, really you just happen to be occupying the seat where whatever's happening is what you get to type about. But when it's
type,
when
right,
it's that,
right.
it's that's it. There's a term. There's probably other better terms, but one of the ones I think sports sociologists or psychologists use, it's called burge, basking in reflected glory, and that's what towns come to feel when these things happen, right? That they're burgeoning, and when you've gone through all these, like the Chiefs are a good example. So many just horrific, bizarre playoff losses over the year. I mean, games that have nicknames, right? That's all you need to know.
Right. They're always bad losses when they become something known as
the no punt game, the pass to himself game, all that stuff. But so there is something about the collective, self-image in all this that I don't know how you quantify it exactly, but you know it when you see it.
Exactly. Well, that sense of community, again, Kansas City was struggling until you showed up, all Kansas City needed was Vahe on the scene, because everything is made better when Vahe is there. And I do mean that seriously. USBWA, the basketball writers, once said that you're considered the ultimate teammate among his colleagues and a role model among his peers, and I couldn't agree more. Everything is better when Vahe's there. I think of that night we were sitting together on the Acropolis Hill, underneath the lit Parthenon at the conclusion of the Olympics in Athens, Greece in 2004. And you and I are sitting there amidst hundreds of people who are singing, playing guitars. And I think, there can't be a better night than this.
That was great. And as I recall, Sean Gregory and Jody Berger.
Yes.
And maybe John Branch was with us before we went up to the Parthenon. Something like that. And it was Mexican music. That was what was weird here right? There was something,
in Greece, right.
It was in Spanish. But I'll tell you something, for all the joy I felt in that moment, we had such relief. I learned a valuable lesson in marriage that night. I called my wife later and thought she'd be so thrilled for me to describe this scene. And she really wasn't. She was like, I'm stuck back here. I thought she'd appreciate it's been a long slog, with my dear friends. And but I'm glad also you mentioned that, Todd, for another reason. I mean, this is really so true. Think how much different all this work would be if you were just in a silo. Okay, I'm carrying my briefcase into the stadium and I don't know anybody.
Right.
you don't go to dinner or veer outside the lines with people like you and Arch and 100 other people we're lucky to know the way we do. That is, I think, a lot of the sustaining impact impact's the wrong word, but the sustaining force in this. I mean, we're lucky to have this feeling with each other, and I'm lucky to work with people I feel this way about every day. It would be pretty empty, even for all the adventures we get, without that nourishment.
Yeah, that camaraderie among journalists is what gets you through, and it makes you think about, who am I doing this for? I'm doing this for the audience who can't be here, and you've done it as well as anybody in 35 years. Last year you mentioned your father, your Vartan, died in April of 2021. What a fabulous career he had. President of the Carnegie Corporation and New York Public Library, Brown University, Presidential Medal of Freedom honor winner, the National Human Presidential Medal. And I was thinking about you because I read all these tributes, including your beautiful eulogy to your father, and there was a comment made by everybody around the world, but one in particular from the former New York City mayor, who said that the passion for your father's public service was matched only by his kindness and compassion for others. And I said, you know what? He could have said that about Vahe. And I really do mean that. I mean, I felt like I had the privilege of getting to know you over these years, and I think all the readers have gotten to know you, and by getting to know you, they've gotten to know all these coaches and athletes and gone to places that they haven't been able to go to. So I just want to say thank you for that, Vahe.
Well, you could hardly say anything more touching, and I really appreciate that, especially as I'm thinking about we're closing in on the 1-year anniversary of my father's death, and I know you've had loss in your life, and I've learned from some of that, from some of your feelings over the years, and I think this is true for you. I was able to move into a place of appreciation pretty fast. I mean, it's still piercing, and you still miss the conversations, but I think you have much the same sense about Kathleen.
Well, thank you, Vahe, and thank you so much for joining us on Press Box Access. It's been so much fun to have you share your stories from your career, and I hope to see you again soon.
Same here, Todd.
Thanks for listening to Press Box Access. You can find us here with a new episode every other Wednesday. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and follow us on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app. We'd love for you to review us. 5 stars would be nice. Follow us on social media. Drop us an email at pressboxaccess@gmail.com. And be sure to spread the word. Everyone is welcome here. This has been a production of Evergreen Podcast. A special thank you to executive producers Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando, producer Bill Hoffman, and our audio engineer Nathan Corson. I'm your host, Todd Jones. It's closing time. Rock on.
Women's Running Stories, where we explore the intersection between running and life. Because every woman who is committed to a running journey has a story to tell, and this is where you'll find those stories. I am host and producer Cherie Louise Turner. I'm a 53-year-old runner, and together with original music by musician and runner Cormac O'Regan, we bring these inspirational stories to life. Please join us to fuel your adventures.